Gary Poole, reporting in Time magazine, said that people were worried. People were scared. They were rushing to their nearest drugstore, their nearest pharmacy, buying up bottles of iodine pills. They were worried that the radiation in Japan would spread across the ocean and hit them here in California. In fact, they had caused such a run on the iodine pills that the price of one bottle jumped from $6 all the way up to $140 for one bottle of pills. But radiation isn't the only thing that people are afraid of. A poll taken before the nuclear crisis in Japan showed that a majority of Americans, most of you, supported nuclear energy and wanted to develop it and engage in it. But a poll taken shortly after the nuclear crisis in Japan showed that a majority of Americans, most of you here, no longer support nuclear energy and you don't want anything to do with it. People are worried that what happened in Japan will happen here, but that fear is unfounded. And so in this speech today, I will inform you what happened in Japan and why you don't need to worry about it. First of all, I will inform you that the earthquake and tsunami complicated things at the nuclear power plant, making it more dangerous than it had to be. Secondly, the biggest danger comes not from a nuclear meltdown, but from the spent fuel pools located in Japan. And lastly, I will tell you why we don't have to worry about what happened there happening here. Alright, my first point is that the earthquake and the tsunami complicated things at the power plant. The reason is, in order for you to understand why that is the case, I have to explain how a nuclear reactor works. Basically, in Japan, water is pumped to the nuclear core. In the core are fuel rods. These fuel rods heat up the water, which causes steam to rise up to a turbine and spin it around. The turbine is connected to a generator, so when the turbine spins, the generator spins, and that produces electricity. When the earthquake struck Japan, however, this knocked out the pumps. It knocked out the power, so the pumps couldn't function, bringing water into the center, into the reactor core. Ordinarily, that wouldn't be a bad thing because we've got the backup generators there too. But then the tsunami struck, which wiped out the generators, effectively leaving the nuclear reactor without any power. The problem with that, this means that in the reactor core, the fuel would get hotter and hotter. Without any extra water being pumped in to cool it down, the fuel rods would get too hot, melt, and release the radiation. This is called a nuclear meltdown. Now, however, a nuclear meltdown would not be as bad as people are making it out. And that leads to my second point, that the real problem comes from the spent fuel pools, not a nuclear meltdown. Again, in order for you to realize why that is the case, I have to explain what the spent fuel pools are. Basically, the nuclear reactor has the fuel rods, and these rods are, after they've been used up in the reactor, they have to be stored somewhere because they still contain radioactive particles that can melt down and release the radiation into the atmosphere. So these fuel rods are kept in a pool of water to be kept cool. But in Japan, when the power is knocked out, no more water can be brought to the pool. This meant that the fuel rods in the pool would get hotter and hotter, just like the ones in the reactor. The difference between these, however, is that in the reactor, there's a giant steel containment vessel. This containment vessel will protect the core, the fuel rods. When the fuel rods melt and release the radiation will be contained within this steel containment vessel. In the fuel pool, there isn't a containment vessel. When the fuel rods melt, all that's standing in their way is a concrete building. This pool housing building can be punctured by when the fuel rods are melting, and that will release the radiation out into the atmosphere and can cause panic. As you can see, the reactor vessel has a containment vessel to keep the radiation from spreading. That is a horrible situation. But we do not have to worry about that happening here. The reason is because, as Daniel Pearlman, science editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, explained, an earthquake of the size and magnitude that hit Japan is not likely to hit us here. Nowhere in the U.S. is an earthquake that big projected to hit. Not even on the San Andreas Fault would something of that magnitude strike us. And so the nuclear power plants that have been built up here, like the San Onofre power plant, which I believe is the closest one to us, has been built to withstand the strongest earthquake that could hit. So that would be about a 7.9, 8.0, something around there. But secondly, we aren't going to be facing a tsunami like they faced in Japan. The reason is because, as Anna Sewell, in an article for the LA Times, is that Southern California does not lie on a subduction zone. A subduction zone is where the plates of the Earth rest together and one of the plates goes under the other. This causes a huge amount, this lifts the water up and causes a huge wave like the tsunami that generated in Japan. Since California doesn't lie on a subduction zone, we won't have to face such a big tsunami. In fact, the biggest amount of waves that will strike us here are about 15 to 20 feet high. And the San Onofre power plant has walls that are 30 feet tall. So even the biggest waves that would hit us would not be enough to overwhelm the power plant there. This means that in California, we won't be facing the complicating factors that struck in Japan. Therefore, the chance of a nuclear meltdown actually occurring has been reduced very, very low. Peter Beckman, in his book, The Health Hazards of Not Going Nuclear, explains that the chance of a nuclear meltdown occurring is about 1 in 22,000. In other words, you have more chance of going out into your car, driving and getting into a car accident than experiencing a nuclear reactor meltdown. The reason is because the coolant, the water being pumped in, keeps the reactors cool, and so without some unforeseen natural disaster, of some sort, knocking out the power, keeping the coolant from getting into the center reactor core, there would be no way that a nuclear meltdown could occur. In this speech, I informed you about the nuclear meltdown in Japan and why we don't need to be worried about it. I informed you, first of all, that the tsunami and the earthquake, they are complicated matters, making the situation more dangerous than it had to be. Secondly, I informed you that the real trouble comes not from a nuclear meltdown, but from the spent fuel pools. And lastly, I informed you that we don't have to worry about what happened there happening here. Therefore, please, please, please do not be like the people in Mr. Poole's article who are rushing to the store to buy iodine pills. Because as I hope you've seen, we really don't have anything to fear.